All right, everyone, welcome. I'm just letting a few folks in, but we can go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us for our next webinar in our DEI series. This has been such a great series thus far, and we are so excited to welcome our guest today. So today we have a few awesome people with us. We have Dr. Caisa Royer, our presenter today. She'll be presenting on the landscape of higher education in prison. And we also have an ASL interpreter here with us, Nathan. Thank you so much for being here with us. I have both of them pinned up there at the top of your screen, so you should be able to see them. All right, so today we're going to be talking about, like I said, the landscape of higher education in prison. Just a few reminders. So our presentation is going to go from 2 to 2:50. We'll have a Q&A session following that. Please remember to mute your sound. You are more than welcome to keep your video on if you'd like. But any questions, comments that come up, feel free to throw them in the chat throughout, and we could go ahead and address those as we get to the Q&A section. All right, so with that, I will go ahead and turn the time over to our speaker. Thank you all for being here.
Hello, everyone. Here, let me share my screen really quickly, and then we can get started. Can everyone see that one okay? Okay, awesome. So hello, my name is Caisa Royer. I am currently a person who wears many hats, but the hat most relevant to this conversation is that I am the current Associate Director of the Utah Prison Education Project, or as you'll hear me refer to it during this talk, is as UPEP. Prior to that, I was a postdoctoral fellow with the Research Collaborative on Higher Education in Prison, which is under the general UPEP umbrella of activities that we do. At the Research Collaborative, we study the landscape of higher education in prison, which is what we'll be kind of talking about during this discussion today. I'm also going to highlight some of the other projects that UPEP works on. I've since moved on from my postdoc position, and I now work as the director of the Pro Bono Initiative at S.J. Cooney College of Law here at the University of Utah. What is common among all of the work that I do is an interest in access. So we're going to talk a lot today about access, and I hope if there's anything that you take away from this talk, it is an additional curiosity or commitment to the concept of access. So when we think about access, we ask questions like, who has access to public goods and services? Who has access to questions and the ability to have those questions answered? Who has access, and this is most prominent in this conversation today, to education? This talk will somewhat be an introduction to post-secondary education in prison. We're going to talk about the landscape of higher education in prison as a whole. We're also going to focus on the work done here at the University of Utah. In my own background, I have been adjacent to higher education in prison since about 2015. So let me start by kind of broadly defining what we mean when we talk about higher education in prison. This refers to anything beyond a high school or GED level education. In most jurisdictions in the United States, there's some kind of legislation requiring people who are incarcerated, often under a certain age, to be working towards a secondary credential. So that would be a GED or a high school diploma. So this is mandatory for those people. When we think about higher education in prison, we're talking not about this mandatory secondary education, but instead about post-secondary, college, university coursework, which is almost always voluntary and optional. Although there might be some trade skills or some other coursework that might be court mandated, for the most part, this work is largely voluntary. And because it is voluntary, there's often a lot of barriers that limit access to this type of programming for people who are incarcerated. So in fact, one of the questions that often gets asked to me when I'm interacting with people who are kind of new to this field is, why should we provide post-secondary education or essentially college to people who are incarcerated? And how this is often framed, at least it was for me the first time that I heard it, was I am working so hard to pay for my college education or my child's college education, or they might say, I am so deeply in student debt still from trying to afford college. Why are you providing it for free to people who have been convicted of a serious crime? And the first time I was ever asked this question, and I think this is a pretty common story, it was from a guard who was working in a prison that I was teaching at in upstate New York. I was at the time enrolled in graduate school at Cornell University, and I was volunteering for Cornell's prison education project. And that was quite the excitement for our students because they were receiving an Ivy League education while they were locked up. So of course, for the guards, it was quite bothersome. They were working really hard to afford college for themselves or for their kids. And we were there providing that Ivy League education for free to people that were imprisoned for committing crimes, people that they saw as less deserving than themselves of that education. So the question is, why should we provide college education to people who are incarcerated? And I think at this point, people who have engaged in the conversation surrounding the mass incarceration problem in the United States know that the United States disproportionately imprisons people of color, specifically Black and brown men. According to the Sentencing Project, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for US residents who were born in the year 2001 is 1 in 9 for all men. That's 1 in 17 for white men, 1 in 3 for Black men, and 1 in 6 for Latino men. So we see these really disproportionate numbers, but also these mass numbers of people who will be touched by the carceral system. And it's not just that incarceration is racist. Incarceration is built on racism. Contemporary punishment in the United States is born from slavery. We see a war on drugs or increases in police presence, arrests, or convictions are all kind of centered around the condemnation of Black and brownness. So higher education in prison is one response to the harms of mass or targeted incarceration in the United States. The same systems that confine these people at higher rates than their white counterparts also prevent them from receiving a quality, accessible education. Higher education opportunities are one way to address this oppression, at least while they're still incarcerated. Beyond the racist roots, we also just know the United States just practices incarceration more than any other country. There are over 2.3 million people incarcerated in prisons and jails right now in the United States. And there are many, many more who are under direct supervision. So that's either probation or parole. Thus, incarceration touches the lives of a significant proportion of the population, many of whom come from backgrounds without social support services. And by that, I mean well-funded public education, SAT prep classes, the types of services that make access to education really easy. The carceral state and the country's commitment to resolve problems through punishment is seen across social systems, including the process of getting into and staying enrolled in universities and colleges. So one of the reasons to provide post-secondary education in prison is that access to education should not be merit-based, should not be class-based or income-based, but instead available to all who are interested in receiving that education. We refer to this as educational equity. But also access to education during prison can help protect against the harm done to individuals through the carceral system. We're not going to focus on this during this talk, but we do know from research that post-secondary education helps people get jobs and get better jobs after leaving prison. And employment is one of the things that protects against recidivism or the likelihood that someone will reoffend after leaving prison, or at least be convicted of another offense. So one of the things that I like to do when I introduce people to the world of higher education in prison is show them our students. And we do call them students. We don't refer to them as inmates or convicts or anything like that, because when they are in an educational space, they are taking on the role of a student. And so that is what they are. So I'm going to show you a couple clips from some videos of a news report from upstate New York. This is the program that I worked with before I joined UPEP. For a variety of reasons, UPEP doesn't have access to like robust interview coverage with our students. So these videos are from another program, but I think the students we have here at University of Utah would say kind of similar things. And as you watch, I would just ask that you kind of consider how the news anchors and others talk and think about these students. I'm going to try to skip around to just highlight our students, but we will probably see a little bit from the news anchors as well.
Tonight, an unprecedented visit to 5 Points Correctional Facility in Romulus. We were given rare access inside the facility as 16 inmates completed their associate degrees through Cayuga Community College.
And out of the 16, 9 graduates became the first class to complete a Certificate of Liberal Arts from Cornell University. News Channel 9's Jennifer Sanders and photojournalist Jack Estabrook go behind prison walls.
I never dreamed that it was possible to do something positive in prison.
The crimes they committed weren't at the forefront. Instead, they were recognized for their accomplishments, their families, pushing them every step of the way.
My initial motivation was to show my kids if I could do it, they could do it out in society.
I am extremely proud of him. To be in this place and to be proud of him is extraordinary to me.
It's emotional because, I mean, he's worked hard for this. You know what I'm saying? And in a stressful situation he's been in, so I mean, I'm very proud of him.
Each one of them has a different story, a different reason to change the course of their lives.
I understand that a college degree will open many doors for me. However, in the process, it opened my mind to a better outlook on life.
Giving hope is underestimated. And when you have hope for a better life, for a better outcome coming out of prison, it can potentially do so much more.
And for the valedictorian, Chris Wood, came a lesson that went beyond the classroom.
He would have spoke to me 5 or 6 years ago, very judgmental. And I like to look at people now and just accept them for who they are and embrace them. It's a blessing to be able to do that because it was a big obstacle in my life.
They look at us as men who have made up their minds to change their mind. But it all starts with the heart.
Some of them will be able to use their degrees when they are out. Those who may never get out say they will use them to help others behind prison walls. In Romulus, Jennifer Sanders, News Channel 9.
Tonight, an unprecedented visit to 5 Points Correctional Facility in Romulus.
A local educational program put together by an Ivy League school looks to turn prison inmates into college graduates.
WENY's Brandon Menard went inside of the Elmira Correctional Facility to speak to prisoners enrolled in the program.
For the past 2 years, Cornell University has been taking education beyond campus into the inmates at the Elmira Correctional Facility.
It is a program offering an associate's degree to men who are incarcerated at the Elmira Correctional Facility. It started in 2018 with its first class and its first cohort. We've now had a few entrance exams at this point, and we are up to about 42 men.
Called the Cornell Prison Education Program, it's financed by a Cornell grant and involves no taxpayer money.
We are funded entirely through private sources. The majority of the funding for the Elmira initiative comes from a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And in addition to that, we provide a lot of in-kind donations from Cornell, and we receive donations from private donors who think that this work is important.
A local educational program.
They're very, very bright.
So I sat down with some of the prisoners involved in the program to see what it means to have something like this available.
I find myself growing with every class that I take for the simple fact that eventually when I get out of here, I'm going to open up my own wood shop. I'm going to become a operator and an owner of a business. And these classes are going to be tremendously helpful for me to understand everything that's going on to run that business.
This is an opportunity to create or reinforce another representation so that I'm not only viewed as, you know, a criminal or an ex-convict, or I'm also, you know, a college graduate.
For one prisoner, it's more about the people who gave him this shot that he appreciates the most.
I love to have the degree. It shows me a physical accomplishment of affirmation of my accomplishments, but even more so, it's what I get from here and the founders of the program that had enough faith in me to come and give me their time, because a lot of people wouldn't do that.
Reporting in Elmira, Brandon Menard, WENY News.
Okay, I like to show videos of students because I think it's important to have their voices be part of this conversation. You know, the news reports are often really highlight kind of the background of these gentlemen and these students, but it's nice to have their own voices as part of the conversation. You also notice the emphasis that they made that no taxpayer money is being used to fund this education for these gentlemen. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this later in this conversation about kind of how programs are funded and some of the pushback against using federal or state funding for these programs. But before we get there, let's talk about what we do at the University of Utah. So the University of Utah Prison Education Project, UPEP, has a multi-pronged approach to the work that we do. The first and most important is we have our on-site college programming at Utah State Prison, which is down in Draper. We view the prison as a satellite campus for the University of Utah. So our goal is to replicate what a classroom on campus would be like down at the prison. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the programming that we offer on the next slide. One of the other things that we do is the Research Collaborative on Higher Education in Prison, which is a team of researchers that all study the landscape of higher education in prison across the country, and all of the ways that incarceration, higher education, and life opportunities intersect. So they work on a lot of really cool projects, a lot of really cool studies. One, which we'll talk about later in this talk, is a study of the use of federal student aid to provide funding for incarcerated students. For a very long time, this was banned. Incarcerated students could not access Pell Grants or federal student aid. This was recently lifted in 2015 as part of a pilot program to see what it would be like to start offering Pell Grants to people who are incarcerated again. So one of the projects that we work on is studying how the rollout of that project has gone, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also study all sorts of other really cool things. One is the use of criminal history in admissions applications. So if the University of Utah asks the question on its application about, have you ever been convicted of a crime, how that information is used in the admissions decision. We study how discipline is used in the college and prison context. So if a student is disciplined at the prison, what does that look like and how involved are their instructors in that discipline? And then, of course, we also work on some national projects looking at the landscape of prison education, which we'll also talk about later in this talk. And then finally, UPEP does a lot of its work through advocacy. We seek to be a local, regional, and national leader in providing ethical prison-university partnerships. We want to provide high quality and meaningful post-secondary opportunities for incarcerated people. It's not just enough to provide opportunity. Those opportunities need to be equitable. They need to be comprehensive, quality education. So some of this advocacy work involves seeking legislation. Right now, we're trying to find additional state funding for education in our state prisons. But some of the other work we do is working on community projects, advocating for our students when they have board meetings or have disciplinary issues at the prison. All right, so what programming do we offer? I've thrown up some pictures of Utah State Prison, which is down in Draper. That is currently one of 2 prisons in the state of Utah. The other one is in Gunnison. Utah State Prison is closing its doors sometime this summer, and everyone who lives there will be moved to a new prison, which is up by the Salt Lake City Airport. So kind of if you're driving out to Tooele, you'll probably drive pretty close to it. But for the meantime, all of our programming is done in Utah State Prison. If you're not familiar with Utah State Prison, it's split into several different individual facilities. We currently offer programming at 5 of the 6 facilities down in Draper. Those facilities are Timpanogos, which is the women's facility, or at least the facility that houses people that the state has deemed to be women. We offer programming at Ochre, which is one of the general population men's facilities, Olympus, which is the mental and physical health facility for men, Promontory, which houses men who are undergoing an addiction treatment program, and the Uintas, which is our maximum and super maximum men's facility. So only one of those facilities houses women, the rest are all men. In any given semester, we have over 30 volunteers who are going out to the prison every single week. We offer programming Monday night through Saturday morning. All together, volunteers donate well over 1,200 hours of time each year to the program. Just like the University of Utah, we offer a 3-semester schedule. So we offer courses in the fall, spring, and summer semesters. For a very long time, since the program was founded in 2017, we were not able to offer credit-bearing programming. So our students were just volunteering to be there, just like we were volunteering to be there. The big burden there is being able to pay for tuition. We strongly believe that our students should not have to put up any of their own money to attend our programming. A big reason for this is that people who are incarcerated make almost no money when they work. So they get paid less than 50 cents an hour, often much less than 50 cents an hour. And almost all of that money needs to go to buying shampoo and Kleenex and tampons and things like that. So we don't think that our students should have to pay for tuition on top of that. They're already going through plenty. We have struggled to find tuition money for our students, but we are slowly working our way there. In fall 2021, we offered our very first credit-bearing courses. We had one class that was at the Honors College here at the U, where University of Utah students, traditional students, drove down to Draper and took a class alongside our UPEP students. So they together completed a full semester course. And then we also had a course sponsored by BYU. BYU had some donors who were willing to help pay for our students' tuition. And again, this semester we have more 4-credit programs. So we're working to a full 4-credit program. In the meantime, we have the flexibility to offer courses that our students want to take. So we've had a lot of really fun, inventive courses. We have students right now taking a genetics class. We've had creative writing, we've had women's studies, we've had masculinity studies, we've had accounting and philosophy. I've personally taught a psychology 101 class. I also taught a legal psychology class. So our students are kind of getting to wander about the academia landscape based on what they're interested in. Beyond our coursework, we also offer all sorts of other types of programs. We offer an art workshop that is virtual right now, where someone from the Museum of Fine Arts at the university Zooms in and leads our students through some art projects, which has been really exciting. We also have a really successful book club series. This semester, they're reading books about alternative histories. So what if history had played out a different way? Last semester, they read books about artificial intelligence. So they're really deep into some weird topics, which is fun. Before COVID, we had a little bit more freedom on what we could offer. And we would offer poetry workshops and an ethics bowl and a pretty successful lecture series. We had a different person come out and lecture each week. But right now, because of COVID restrictions, we're trying to limit the number of people that go in and out of the prison. Okay, so who are our students? Our students come from all sorts of backgrounds. We've had people who enter the program with only a high school diploma. We've had people in the program who have graduate degrees, master's degrees. So it's quite the range of experiences. Some of our students have had very negative experiences with education in the past. and they're very wary of formal education. I had one student who dropped out in the 7th grade, and so this was their first time like really trying to get excited about education again. So it's really cool to have that range of people. One common misconception about incarcerated people is that they have nothing to do during the day, that they just sit there and twiddle their thumbs. This is the furthest thing from the truth. Most of our students have full-time jobs, so they work all day. They hold other leadership roles within the prison. They participate in a lot of different types of programming. So they're very, very busy. Every semester, it's like Jenga, trying to figure out how to offer courses so that all of our students have the time to attend. So they are very much enrolled in the program because they want to be there and because they're committed to their education. It's not to fill their time. They really are working so hard. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about what UPEP does, and I'm happy to answer a million questions about it at the end of this talk, let's talk a little bit about the landscape of higher education in prison. So when we do research in this field, we have to do a lot of definitional work. There are a lot of people who are going into prisons and offering different types of opportunities, book clubs or knitting clubs, or maybe like a Shakespeare or some sort of acting performance-based class. And these experiences are all really wonderful, but when we're talking about post-secondary education or higher education in prison, we have to know what formally counts as higher education in prison. So the Research Collaborative uses this definition. A higher education in prison program must provide post-secondary education. So it must be something beyond that high school or GED credential. A higher education in prison program must be formally affiliated with a college or university. This is something that I think we'll see change in the next couple of years. We have a lot more community partners who are doing this work. Often though, they are affiliated with some college or university. They're just the ones who are doing a lot of the administrative or legwork to make this happen. And then third, higher education in prison program has to use a secondary credential as a requirement for admission. So this is kind of what excludes a lot of those book clubs or theater programs, is that the students all must have a high school diploma or a GED or something similar to participate. So using this definition, we pose the question, what does the landscape of higher education in prison programs look like? How many of these programs exist in the United States? So the Research Collaborative worked on creating an annual survey of higher education in prison programs. We worked on this alongside the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison, which is kind of our national organization, and some really wonderful researchers at the University of Berkeley. This survey was first launched in March 2020, which, let me tell you, is the wrong time to launch a project because everyone else had lots of other things on their minds in March of 2020. We solicited participants through a national listserv of higher education in prison stakeholders, and we also solicited known HEP or higher education in prison programs that weren't on that listserv. It's a very small community. It's a very close-knit community, so it's pretty easy to find all of the people providing this education. And it's a really integrated community where a lot of people are involved on national listservs. The survey had 92 questions, mostly focused on where programming is being offered and to whom, and what certificates, degrees, or other types of services like book clubs or lecture series are being offered. And we took all of that data and we created a national directory of higher education prison programs. This is available for free online. If you ever get curious and you move someplace and you want to volunteer with a program, you can search for it and find the programs in your area. And I'm stealing some of the graphics that were used in this throughout the rest of this talk. So here is a map of the known higher education in prison programs in the United States. it's a little blurry. I apologize again. This is available on the National Directory if you're curious. The circles are the colleges and universities that do this work, and the squares are the prisons, jails, or other facilities of confinement that this work is being done in. As you can tell, most of the programs are kind of settled in areas with high population, but we see a lot in the South, a lot in California, and a lot in the upper Midwest. In total, we know of 374 higher education and prison programs across the United States. These programs are working with 420 academic institutions, and they work at 522 facilities of confinement. Most of these are prisons and jails, but we have some halfway houses and some residential treatment facilities. In Utah, this work is being done by 5 different programs beyond UPEP. We have programming at Davis Technical College, Snow College, Salt Lake Community College, and Uinta Basin Technical College. Okay. And this is a graph of when all of these programs were founded. So when did they start offering coursework in prison? As you can tell, it's been kind of a slow uptick in programs. And we see a huge increase in 2015. 2015 is when the pilot program allowing some schools to start accessing federal Pell Grants for incarcerated students began. So we see as that accessibility increased, we see more programs entering the space. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about Pell Grants in a minute. So what types of academic institutions provide coursework inside of prisons? We see most of them are public 2-year schools, but we also see a lot of private nonprofit 4 years and public 4-year schools in this community. And as you can kind of guess based on the numbers I showed earlier, most of these programs offer programming at only one facility, one jail, one prison, but many of them offer programming at multiple prisons. So the University of Utah only works at Utah State Prison, but there are other programs in the state of Utah that work at jails, or they work down in Gunnison as well. So they have a little bit more spread. And we saw with the onset of COVID that a lot more programs started providing remote instruction, but there's very limited access to internet or other types of technology in most prisons. So remote instruction doesn't really look like you or I taking a class on Zoom. What it really looks like is correspondence work. Correspondence work is you write to someone in the mail and they write back to you. So you get all of your readings and assignments in the mail, you do them, you mail them back to someone else, or someone else comes and picks them up, and then they return it to you. We also see a lot of broadcast educational opportunities. So videos that are pre-recorded and sent in for students to engage in that coursework. We are starting to see a little bit more technology become available. It's one of the very few benefits of COVID. It's just kind of forced some advancement in the prison space where more computers and hopefully more internet are starting to go inside. Okay, so when we're talking about the landscape of higher education in prison, we kind of have 3 areas of focus, or 3 things that we're really trying to prioritize as new programs enter this space. So these are kind of our guiding principles of what makes a good higher education in prison program. The first is a focus on equity. We want these programs to uphold the same high standards and opportunities that exist in other quality higher education spaces, despite the fact that they're teaching people inside of a prison. In terms of equity, we're also want to maintain attention to how race, gender, ability, economic status, sexuality, all influence every dimension of this field, from teaching and learning to how curriculum is built. These are spaces that are already have very deep markers of racism. and racial disparities. And so we don't want higher education and prison programs to further exaggerate any gaps based on race or gender or any other kind of identity. And this is very easy to do because prisons are very antiquated, and who has access to programming tends to be built based on some sort of already existing privilege. So people who have an educational background tend to be the people that have access to education in prison as well. Second, we are also interested in excellence. We want intellectually rigorous programming. We want programming that is individualized to the students and to the classes, that is comprehensive, that is sustained. So we don't want programs that are just coming in fall 2021 and then suddenly disappear fall 2022. We want programs that are built to last, that are self-sustaining. And then finally, my favorite is access. We have to continually strive to understand and overcome the barriers to student engagement and success. And this has to be built on inclusivity. Part of that inclusivity means that we as instructors, as people that work in this field, have to challenge our own notions of incarceration status, what it means to be incarcerated and what it means to deserve education. So part of this is a commitment to the idea that a crime of conviction or a type of sentence disqualifies someone from a quality education. At least at UPEP, we believe that it doesn't, it shouldn't, that everyone is deserving of education if they want it. So now I'm going to ask some kind of overarching questions that are brought up a lot in this space, in the higher education prison space. And these questions are all kind of rooted in these ideals, especially the ideal of access. And so I'll present a little bit more research, but I'm hoping that you can kind of take these questions away with you and kind of mull them over as you think about who should have access to education after this talk is over. Okay, so the first question is, who should have access to post-secondary education while they're incarcerated? So I already kind of hinted at this on the last slide. There's a lot of conversation, especially in funding circles, about whether certain types of crimes should exclude someone from receiving college education, whether certain types of sentences should exclude someone from receiving higher education. The easy example is if someone who has been, who is going to be incarcerated for the rest of their life, whether they've received life in prison or a death sentence, whether they should have access. And a lot of funders believe that unless those people are going to be out in the community, eventually, there's no benefit to society as a whole by trying to educate those people. And of course, the pushback here is that any type of education benefits the individual, and that benefiting the individual is enough. Certainly prisons are communities and are deserving of advancement and deep thought and, growth, even if those people are not going to be re-entering society. So this is a question that's quite often thought about. And one of the reasons it's quite often thought about is because there's very limited access to higher education in prison. As you saw on the map that I showed you before, it's not every college and university that offers this. It's not every prison, certainly not every jail that has access to higher education. And for the programs that are doing this work, they can only enroll so many students. So 50% have over 1,000 students. Those tend to be the correspondence-based programs. For programs that are working in person like UPEP does, they tend to be somewhere between 20 to 150 students. So again, this is a very limited proportion of the number of people incarcerated in those spaces. The next question that I asked you to consider is, what courses should programs provide to incarcerated students? There's, again, a lot of pressure from funders and legislators that programming inside of prisons should be focused on reentry, should be focused on making sure those people don't commit crimes again, that they're able to get a job. So we have a lot of requests, even from students, for this type of programming that will help them get a job when they get out. This tends to be business or technology or welding or other trade skills classes. And so this is often what students ask for. They want coursework that helps them get a job when they get out. The pushback here is that there are a lot of psychologists in the audience, I assume, and we know that liberal arts education is very beneficial to the individual. Taking a men and masculinities class is so beneficial. Taking an art class can open minds in ways that, you know, a business class doesn't always. And so there's certainly benefit to offering different types of programming. Here's a breakdown again from that national survey of higher education and prison programs of the type of coursework offered. Specifically, I want you to look on the right. We have the types of degrees that are offered. Most programs cannot afford to offer degrees to incarcerated students, but of the ones that do offer degrees, we see the most degrees are Associate of Arts degrees. A lot of them tend to be Associate of Arts in General Education or General Studies. We see much fewer bachelor's degrees, although it is increasing quite a bit over the last couple of years. And then we see almost no graduate degrees, although there are several master's degree programs. Okay, third question is, when should inside, for people who are incarcerated, and outside, people who are not incarcerated, students be treated differently? So this is that question of equity. And I think I said that UPAP likes to think of ourselves as a satellite campus of the University of Utah. We want the experience of going to class with us be just the same as the experience of going to class up here in Salt Lake. But we also know that our students have barriers to their own education. They don't have access to a computer lab, except in our classroom. So if they're in class with us, they can have access to computers. If they're not, they can't. There's no access to internet for people who are incarcerated. There's limited access to the library, right? So these things make it harder for them to complete assignments than it does for someone who is on campus. And so even though our students demand of us that we offer equally as rigorous programming as we would on campus, we do have to think through, how should students be treated differently? Like, what are the spaces in which we need to make some accommodations? One of the ways that accommodations are made are to try to offer other support services inside of prison. So here is another response to that national survey. We asked what types of programming or services outside of coursework that the students completed. As you'll see, quite a few programs offer library access. We do that here. Our students can get books for free from Marriott Library, just like you or I could. We also see a lot of study halls, some computer labs, and much fewer do we see things like film series or help with job placement or a student council or government. So those are things that some people have started exploring, but aren't widely available to people who are incarcerated yet. And then this is sort of like a pet question of mine. One of the specific areas of differences between on-campus students and in-prison students is the role of discipline. And by that I mean the prison has security interests that often interfere in the classroom space. Guards routinely remove students from educational programming for disciplinary reasons or purported disciplinary reasons. And higher education and prison programs are rarely involved in any of those decisions. So discipline tends to interfere quite often with educational goals. So the Research Collaborative did a study where we were looking at what this discipline looked like. It followed a semi-structured interview protocol where we had instructors, staff, former students, and parents all kind of talk through how discipline had interfered in the classroom space. So I want to share a couple of quotes from our participants, especially our former alumni participants. So this is a program alumnus talking about how what types of things were deemed to be inappropriate for students. He said, when you're talking about prisons in general, they are punitive structures from the tops of their heads to the bottoms of their feet. It's a system that is based on intimidation and punishment, It is inflexible. It does not allow itself to mutate or morph into a more compassionate system. It's incapable of that. It's only created to enforce rules and punish people that break those rules. So you can imagine that there are deep consequences to students that get into disciplinary trouble. And I don't mean like because they, had a violent incident. It could just be that they had the wrong pencil in their cell, or they were found with the wrong book. And those sorts of things can lead to what we refer to as punishment of deprivation. They're removed from programming, they lose services, they lose their school supplies. And then also we often see harassment from guards. As I talked about at the beginning of this talk, guards are often a little frustrated that students are receiving education for free. And their response to this is often harassment. So here is another quote from one of our participants. They said, we would have to put our books on a station where they check everything. And they would sometimes throw our books on the floor on purpose just to harass us. And although that book might not have gotten damaged, at that moment, that person's peace may have gotten damaged. And so you go to class, you're supposed to have this test that you've been preparing for, but the officer done took you out of your zone, so to say. So this harassment from guards, even if it doesn't take anything away from these students physically, it can really damage the educational experience. So when we're talking about the landscape of higher education in prison and access, we have to think about the fact that discipline really affects who has access to these types of services. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to try to go quick because I know I've been talking for too long, are how programs are funded. Most higher education in prison programs receive funding through private foundations or donations. About a quarter receive money from the college or university, but it's becoming apparent that there needs to be some sort of federal student aid in order for students to afford tuition. Part of the answer to that is what we call Second Chance Pell. Second Chance Pell is the offering of federal student aid to students who are incarcerated. This was banned in the 1994 crime bill. So it used to be that people who are incarcerated had access to federal student aid in the same way that you or I would. They just have to fill out the FAFSA, then they get a check in the mail, and they can use that to pay for their education. This was banned in 1994. And then in 2015, the Obama administration opened a pilot program that allowed 64 programs to have their students start being able to apply for federal student aid as well. Now there are over 200 programs involved in this pilot test. And in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, Congress passed a complete renewal of this program. So soon, hopefully by 2023, anyone who wants to access this federal money and is incarcerated should be able to. So we're very excited about that. The Vera Institute of Justice is providing all the technical assistance for the pilot program. And so they're studying kind of how the allotment of federal student aid for incarcerated people plays out. We see some interesting demographic differences. Here we have race comparisons among the US college population, the prison population, and people enrolled in Second Chance Pell. One of the things you'll see is that white people are overrepresented in terms of the prison population in Second Chance Pell. So more white people are getting this opportunity than people of color. We also see age differences. So we see that younger people tend to be underrepresented in Second Chance Pell. And the reason for this is because they tend to be dependents. So in order to get Pell money, you have to apply for the FAFSA. If you're a dependent, so if you're under the age of 25, you have to send in your tax information and also your parents' tax information. When you're incarcerated, it's very difficult to get your hands on your parents' tax information. Prisons don't often let that kind of information come in and out of the prison. So it's going to be really hard to fill out the FAFSA when you're a dependent. And this prevents them from getting access to Second Chance Pell. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead and just talk about, now that you've heard a little bit about higher education in prison, how can you support us? There's lots of different ways. The number one thing is you can volunteer for us. We're always looking for teaching assistants or other people to be involved. You can also donate. We have an Amazon wish list that I'm happy to send out to you. We need supplies and books and technology all of the time. The number one thing is to tell campus leaders that you would like prison education programming. Just reemphasizing to them that we would love to be able to pay for tuition for our students and that they have the power to make that happen. Have your departments fund financial support for teachers, course releases for teachers, things like that. So you're also welcome to email us, and we're happy to get you in touch with whoever you need to be in touch with. All right, so I'm sorry for going a little faster at the end. Thank you for listening, and I'm welcoming any questions.
Hi there. I put a question in the chat about the Pell Grants. So do they not cover all of the tuition? I guess I'm kind of lost on that part, because I was under the impression that once the trial period started, we would be able to kind of see more inmates getting full tuition coverage, and then more for credit classes. Is there a step that I'm missing there that makes it so that you can't make that happen? I mean, I know that you are trying, of course, and have that one class in there.
Yeah, so the trial period hasn't ended yet. It won't end until 2023. There are a couple of barriers here. One is that theoretically it covers all of tuition, but in practice it doesn't seem to cover all of tuition, especially for schools with higher tuition amounts. I think that it would probably cover most of ours here at the University of Utah. Second, Pell Grants help with no administrative costs, so they're just used for tuition and books, which means that the administration of UPEP in general still needs to have university support so that we can hire staff, so that we can have financial aid people go out to the prison and things like that. So our hope is that it will help us work towards a degree granting program, and we're just not sure how it'll shake out yet. And then I see another question from, oh, sorry, did you have more?
Oh, I just didn't thank you.
Yeah. I also see a question from Ashley about there's a correlation between these programs and reduced recidivism. We are not in the business of recidivism. It's just not one of the concerns that we like to think very deeply about. We believe that everyone that wants access to education should have it. We're also an abolitionist organization, so we tend not to think too deeply about recidivism. But yes, there's an incredible correlation between education and reduced recidivism after people leave prison. I see a question from Karen. If access to computers, internet is so often denied or interrupted, would it make more sense to offer these courses correspondence? Yeah, so that's why most remote sharing, remote programming tends to be correspondence-based, is because internet is so unreliable. However, it's just so different doing packet-based learning versus having a live instructor in class who's able to answer your questions at the moment. You're able to interact with fellow students in an educational space. It's just a very different environment. And so that's kind of the ideal. The ideal is to have in-person, face-to-face contact. Correspondence is, in my opinion, not as good as even Zoom learning. So we're hopeful to have more options for that in prisons. Any other questions?
I'm also curious whether your thoughts on this, and also if any of your students have shared insights on this, but something that I know that we've talked about in programs that are involved in education is the school to prison pipeline, and how that's something we have a lot of data on and something that we would love to interrupt. And so, yeah, I just love your thoughts on how we can interrupt and how we can intervene and work in that intervention piece, especially, yeah, as you've worked with students, if they've shared their thoughts on what could be helpful in that prevention piece.
It's not my area of expertise, and I haven't I've first spoken to students about the school to prison pipeline either, so I'm not quite sure what they would offer. We certainly know that it exists, and certainly know that it needs to be interrupted. You know, in a space where carcerality is such an important pillar of American culture, colleges and universities are just as complicit in that pipeline as anyone else's, and so it's kind of our responsibility in every space to approach issues without that punishment focus. And so that's kind of the ask that I think. It's not necessarily a like, how do you interrupt, but how do you in your own mind think through these problems differently, think through discipline in the classroom differently, think through discipline on campus differently. Another question from Karen in the chat. Is face-to-face instruction often interrupted, denied for disciplinary reasons? Yes, 100%. And I'm sorry, I kind of sped through that section, but yeah, so we often see students being removed from the classroom for disciplinary reasons. We see instructors denied entry to facilities for, you know, they have the wrong pants on. And so they don't get to teach class that night. And then we also have lockdowns that prevent programming. So if a prison is on lockdown for any reason, it means that programming does not go on. It means that class is canceled. So like yesterday, I got an email from someone at one of our prisons, Olympus. They have a COVID lockdown right now because someone tested positive for COVID. And that means that all programming at that facility is closed for the near future. If there's a thunderstorm going on, everything's on lockdown, which means you can't offer. So yeah, face-to-face instruction is often interrupted. Any other questions?
I'm just wondering if you run into any issues with students having learning disabilities and that, you know, being a barrier for them in the education program, and also if there's any resources for them for assessment and that area.
Such a good question. Yes and no. Technically, prisons, the only law of the land that is higher than prison security interest is ADA. ADA has this kind of weird carve out where the prison has to provide ADA accommodations, even if they normally wouldn't because of security concerns. So technically, things like learning disability tests and things like that should be covered under the ADA, should be available to our students. In practice, I haven't seen a lot of that happening. We have a volunteer this semester who's in a power wheelchair, and so he went into the classroom and literally none of the like wheelchair access buttons worked. So he like had to open all the doors himself. So we don't see ADA like actually working the way that it should. I've had many students who have learning disabilities or even intellectual disabilities. We have one student right now who's blind. And so it is a struggle, and there's very few resources that are available to them. And I think it's kind of the interesting part of this work is you have to be really flexible as an instructor in ways that you don't have to in traditional courses, because your students hold you accountable. They really need the services and they don't have any place else to get them.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if that is all of our questions, I would just love to give a big virtual round of applause. And also thank you so much to Caisa for presenting for us, for Nathan for interpreting for us, and thank you everyone for attending.